Hey, what's up you guys? My name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be discussing You by Caroline Kepnes. If the name You sounds familiar to you at all, it may be because a few years ago Netflix came out with an original series that was actually based on the book. I'm not entirely sure how close of an adaptation the TV show is because I personally only watched the first couple of episodes, and from what I saw it was very similar and loyal to the book, but I have no idea how the rest of the seasons go. Before we get too far into this review, I did want to mention a few trigger warnings that were relevant to the book, including stalking, self-harm, suicidal ideation, toxic and abusive friendships and relationships, assault, both physical and sexual, gaslighting, abduction, and murder. So if any of these things are liable to be incredibly triggering or bothersome to you, please have discretion while watching the rest of this review or reading the book. Within the book, we follow Joe Goldberg as he works in a bookstore and discovers his latest obsession, You. Or more specifically, Guinevere Beck, who is also known as just Beck to her friends. One day, Beck comes in as a customer of Joe's bookstore, and like any sane person would do, Joe takes her name off of her credit card and searches her online, finding all of her different socials, and effectively finding her in person. Because of the information he was able to piece together over everything he was able to find on the internet, he was able to find her in real life and insert himself into it, beginning a period of stalking, although he would beg to disagree over that label. Surrounding himself with her and her life, they begin to develop a very complicated relationship with each other. And in order to try and uncomplicate things, Joe resorts to some very drastic and desperate measures in order to do so, which is murder. He takes on a habit of abducting and murdering different people who happen to have toxic influences in her life. And while the fact that they are toxic is true, his primary thoughts for thinking that they're toxic is that it takes time and interest away from him, whereas like there are a whole host of other reasons why it's actually toxic as well. But these disappearances and murders don't result in a positive improvement with their relationship with each other like Joe had planned. And eventually Beck needs her distance, so she takes a few weeks and steps back and like quits contact with Joe, but that doesn't stop his obsession having a full grasp on him and overwhelming literally every action that he does, until he meets another girl who's crazy, could be a good match for his own, except he doesn't love her. He loves you, Beck. So as for some of my own thoughts on the book, I'll be honest, I was uncomfortable from page 1 because just the toxic, nice guy and incel vibes were off the charts from the very beginning of the book. Like, even without having seen the first episode or two of the TV show, like, I knew where this was going because Joe's obsession and psychotic behavior is not subtle at all. Not that it's meant to be, but just like you definitely kind of have an idea of what you're getting into from the very beginning, and it's definitely uncomfortable to read. And the discomfort is definitely amplified by the fact that Joe, as a narrator, refers to you as the object of his desires. Like, the way that he talks, it's like he is talking to you as the reader, as though you, the reader, were Beck, the character that he is obsessed with in the book. And that kind of reading dynamic I thought was so effective in its disturbingness, but also just incredibly unique. I have never personally seen anything like that utilized before, and I think that this book was a really good way to do so, for what it was trying to do at least. I mean, obviously, like, I'm not gonna go and be like, oh, this was a great book, you need to read it, but I do think that it was incredibly well written, and if you know what you're getting into, I would certainly recommend it. It's just not one where, like, it's not like it's fluffy or cute or anything like that. Like, you kind of just have to know what you're getting into from the start in order to appreciate it as a book. Well, obviously, it is a little bit hard to read because of the psychotic nature. It certainly isn't so disturbing that you can't binge read the book. And in fact, it is written well enough that I was able to binge read most of it. I was definitely enthralled and had the urge to continue reading at any time that I was reading it. So there were definitely a lot of times where I read a lot longer than I had been planning to, just because it was so easy to read and fast to read and just kept you invested in what exactly was going on. And the darker elements of the book aren't nearly as dark and graphic as they could be, so that definitely does a lot to add to the readability and experience of the novel. I will have to say that, like, when I say graphic, I mean more in the sense of like gore and violence and things like that, which it's definitely not, but it is very graphic in the sense of being a bit more crude and sexual in a lot of aspects. There are definitely the different aspects to the book that does make it a darker read, obviously, like the murder and abduction and things like that. But I wouldn't go so far as to necessarily personally classify this as a horror novel, because we really didn't go that violent or graphic with the darker elements. So I could like hear the argument of it being more of like a thriller or something like that. I do think that it could very easily be interpreted as a satire of a variety of things, including obsession, objectification, possessiveness, misogyny, internalized and projected, hypocrisy, hipsters, social media presentations, and the amount of information that you can find about people online are all definitely things that are either satirized or just are being made a point of them being a problem. Because while I do say that like I kind of interpret it as a satire, it's definitely not so blatantly in your face as something like American Psycho is, for example. And while we are on the topic, I do want to note a bunch of parallels to American Psycho. I definitely think that that was probably a big inspiration for the book, because there are definitely a lot of very similar vibes that you get while reading. And like literally while I was reading, and as soon as I made the observation that I was like, huh, like this kind of gives me American Psycho vibes, a reference to the author Bret Easton Ellis was made within the book. So I was like, oh, like this must be intentional. And then even like later within the book, like a direct reference to American Psycho was also made. So I think it was definitely very, very intentional, as was a bunch of Stephen King references within the book as well, which I do find incredibly funny that Stephen King is the author that has a blurb on this particular edition's cover, because there is a lot of reference to Stephen King, but more specifically like within the bookstore in the book and the release of Dr. Sleep, and like references to The Shining and things like that. So I think it's fucking hilarious that they were able to get Stephen King to do a blurb for the cover, and that he was like into it, because his blurb is, quote, hypnotic and scary, ... totally original, unquote. So I think it's really funny that he actually ended up reading this. It had to have been very, very meta for him, and I think it would have been fucking hilarious. But going back to the whole American Psycho thing, I think that it definitely does have a lot of very, very similar aspects. If you happen to be familiar with the book American Psycho at all, I do have a review of that if you want a little bit of a vibe for like how I'm comparing them. There's certainly a lot of, you know, crude sexuality within it that is very, very reminiscent in both books. And obviously there's murder, but definitely like You is not nearly as like crass and graphic as American Psycho was, to the point where I would say it's the difference between being tasteful and untasteful. I think this was a very, very good, like it did a great job at being a satire without being so questionable, scandalous perhaps, just without being so grossly intense. So I think if you are looking for something that satirizes that kind of thing, and like American Psycho was just too much for you, that this would be a really, really good alternative. Obviously, it's not the exact same thing, and there's definitely very different things that they are satirizing, but there also is that overlap of like some of the similarities and the same things that they are satirizing, that I think fans of one book would be fans of the other. Fans it's hard to say that you're a fan of this kind of book because it is very, very specific in what it is trying to do, but that doesn't make it a bad book in any way. It's not one that you necessarily read for fun, you know? Whereas there are a lot of other books that are purely for fun or the entertainment factor and things like that. Whereas this is the kind of book, well, it definitely does have its entertaining elements and aspects to it. I think the primary focus is more so making a point than it is just to be fun to read. But like, complimentary, like, I don't want that to sound like it's a criticism or a negative. It just is, you know? And it certainly wouldn't stop me from reading it again. I definitely think in a few years I would give it another go because it was certainly interesting enough to pique my interest. Interesting enough to pique my interest naturally. But I think you know what I'm saying. You know, it was definitely easy enough to read. I got through it fairly quickly and it was very, very easy to comprehend and visualize certain elements of it. However, on the flip side, it definitely wasn't the most visual of reads for me. Like, it wasn't a book that triggered the most like vivid visual experience while reading it, but that didn't make it necessarily like a worse reading experience than other books were. It was just a little bit different. I'm just one of those people where it's like sometimes books will trigger like intense, vivid visuals to where it like almost feels like I'm watching a movie as I read it, whereas other books don't do that, but like I still can fully comprehend what's going on and still enjoy the book just as much. It's just a different reading experience. So it was more like the latter for me. But yes, if you are looking for the kind of thing that's a little bit creepy, if you perhaps want to prove a point to other people about certain behaviors, you could definitely recommend it to them after giving it a read for themselves. I will have to say there were certain aspects of the book that were a little too real and a little too uncomfortable at points as somebody who has actually had a stalker before. Not nearly to the same degree or category that this book features, but I did have somebody who would kind of like stalk me at one of my old places of work, and it was just a very uncomfortable situation, which thankfully I have been past for several years and like I'm fine and safe and that's all good. But it definitely made this feel a little too real at certain points, and it was very, very personally uncomfortable. But it wasn't so much to where it was like actively triggering or anything for me. It just was just like, oh, I am so glad I avoided this kind of dramatic situation, you know? Another thing that I did want to note, not in reference to the content of the book specifically, but the book itself, I did actually receive in the Down the Rabbit Hole book box for the month of August. They are a monthly subscription box that sends you one dark read a month, as well as 4 to 5 bookish items that are direct references to the book itself. So if you have any interest in checking that out, I will go ahead and leave my video reviewing and unboxing it down below, as well as all of the links to Caroline Kepnes, the book, the TV show, all that jazz. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I had a blast hanging out with y'all. Peace. Oh, I am popping in post-review with just one minor criticism that I have that I wanted to note. And it's not like a major thing, I'm just a little bit irked by the fact that the one singular queer character that is featured in the book, very, very toxic, very, very just blech, not good representation. I don't think that it was intended to be any kind of, you know, commentary on the queer community or anything like that. I think it was just how it happened to work out. But